participants are really sort of high-paid, specialist people, then you're going to have to compensate for their time while they participate in the tests in some sense and that sort of thing. But also just, setting up the lab, hiring the lab, that sort of thing is going to put constraints on it. So typically what happens is you have 5 to 10 participants, but it can be many more if you're doing remote web-based testing or mobile testing. Okay, so if you're just saying, log in and test this thing for me, it's a lot easier to get a lot of different things because you don't have to worry about setting up the lab, about having the recordings, the video recordings and that sort of thing. You're doing a different type of testing which is less expensive. And some experts say that, well, until you stop learning anything new, you keep on testing. That's expensive. Okay, so it's probably better to think about your testing as being time constrained and getting the most out of any given testing session as you can. Skip that one, sorry. There are a lot of slides in this set. You can have a look at them. They're available online, but don't want to spend too much time. So laboratory experiments, right? So what we're doing when we set up a laboratory experiment is that we've been quite explicit that we're testing hypotheses, right? So we want to test whether particular variables influence the way that people use the interface or something like that. And we've particularly looked at different participants versus same participants versus matched participants. So different participants is basically having two sets of people and you randomly assign them to different experimental conditions. One set of people does it with one experimental condition and the other does it with the other experimental condition, and you see if there's any significant difference between the two groups. Did this group of people manage to learn it better or perform it better in a quicker amount of time, or were they able to remember better how to do the tasks, whatever it is that you're measuring, right? You can have this same situation where you test everybody on this condition and then you test everybody on that condition and then you test everybody on another condition and you compare them with each of the conditions. That one can be problematic because assuming that your condition is just one variation in an otherwise same piece of software, when they do it with this condition, they're learning the rest of the software interface, so that when they do it with this condition, they're already familiar with everything in the software interface apart from that condition, and so on. You can get around that by having people starting on different conditions, so one set of people start on that condition and other people start on that condition and then you swap them over, that type of thing. But it can be problematic. And then this idea of having matched participants where you might have the people who use the existing software in one group and you test them on the new software. The novices who've never used the existing software but they're going to use this new software, and you test them in a separate group and you see if the condition has more of an impact for the experts or for the novices, that type of thing. Okay, living labs. So Philips love their living labs. So they look at their new home technology, like their lighting systems and that sort of thing, the Hue lighting systems, in the most realistic possible way. So they basically put people in a hotel room type thing and let them live there for however long it takes, 24 hours a day, and they're being recorded constantly, and you can imagine the ethical issues with this, right? But, you know, this is a really serious research from a really serious company, and they do take into account all those ethical issues involved in it. And they basically say, you know, we couldn't do the development that we do for our products without having this type of situation. Obviously, they're a huge multinational company. They've invested a huge amount of money into this, but it is a possibility, right? I'm going to skip again. Right. On to natural settings, and particularly field studies. So the aim with field studies is you go into the wild, so to speak, and you want to understand what people do in their natural environment, so in their office or in their home or whatever, and how the technology impacts them in that situation. They're often used to identify opportunities for new technologies. So say, yeah, that's what they do, but that's really inefficient. You know, they've got the two systems working side by side. They don't interact, but they're using a lot of data that they're having to manually transfer between that type of thing. They look at the design requirements, so if they know that particular sets of people work together in particular ways, then that has to get integrated into the design. The best way of introducing new technology, you know, maybe who are the key players, who should be the ones who are the sort of champions of the new technology, who are the ones who are going to influence the people in the workplace the most, maybe. And to evaluate the technology in real use as opposed to in a laboratory setting. But like a laboratory setting, you collect the data either by observation, which includes audio or video logging, and through interviews. But the data in this case is usually presented as anecdotes or excerpts or critical incidents. So focusing on where things were out of the ordinary in some way. Not necessarily where they went wrong, it's just an unusual use of the technology or something like that, something unexpected. You might also look at patterns, particularly where those patterns are patterns that you would like to get rid of. And narratives. And the aim is to show how the products are being used in the natural environment, okay, because it's not always the way that was intended, is essentially the message. And I'm expecting the fire alarm to go off any second. Okay. And finally, not involving users. So cognitive walkthrough. It's usually performed by an expert in cognitive psychology, and the expert walks through the design to identify potential problems using psychological principles. And they'll look at, so what impact will an interaction have on a user? What cognitive processes are required? So do they have to think a lot to do this particular task, or is it intuitive and natural? And what learning problems may occur? So if they've got to do several things at once, it can be a lot harder to learn the process than if it's a straight linear path through something. That's the type of thing. And the analysis focuses on the goals and the knowledge, so does the design lead the user to generate the correct goals and to take the desired path through the usage of the software. So in order to perform a cognitive walkthrough, you need a specification or a prototype of the system. You don't need a full working system, right? So it can be done at a relatively early stage of development. You need a description of the task that the user is to perform on the system and a complete written list of the actions that are required to complete that task. And some indication of the levels of experience and knowledge of the users. So are they familiar with something like this existing interface or, you know, that type of thing. And then for each action that the user has to take in order to achieve that task, the evaluators have to go, so is the effect of the action the same as the user's goal at that point? So by doing that thing, does the user feel like they're working towards their goal, or is it counterintuitive in the path towards their goal, and that type of thing? So they're looking at, if you like, what's known as cognitive dissonance issues, where the designer's got some idea in their head about the way that things should be done, but that doesn't necessarily match with the way that the user thinks should be done. And when those things don't match, then you have a design problem. Okay, heuristic evaluation. So we have usability criteria, or heuristics, which are identified, and you get evaluators that look to see if those are violated. So the types of things that you have as heuristics are the system behaviour is predictable. Okay, so you can see it's similar to the cognitive walkthrough, but it's, in a sense, a bit more hand-wavy. Okay? Right, so rather than looking at specific steps through the process and measuring them quite specifically, we're looking at things like, is the system behaviour predictable? Right? Heuristic evaluation, though, can be very effective at finding a large number of usability problems, and it's flexible and it's cheap. Right? So, like cognitive walkthroughs, it can be done on a very early stage of a prototype or even a mock-up on paper of the system, and if it can identify about 75% of the usability problems, it's a very good, cheap thing to do at that early stage. Okay, so Nielsen, who introduced this idea of heuristic evaluation, had 10 heuristics. Does the system always keep users informed about what's going on? Does the system use language that's familiar to the user? Does the system support undo and redo? Does it follow standards and conventions? Make it difficult to make errors? Make objects, actions, and options visible, which is related to the memory load of the user? Allow the users to tailor frequent actions. So if they're a frequent user, can they take shortcuts? Keyboard shortcuts, for example. Minimize irrelevant or rarely needed information. Express errors in plain language. Provide help and documentation. So all of these things are related, very closely related to the things that the cognitive psychologists would be looking at with a cognitive walkthrough. It's just taking them and turning them into natural language form that a less expert person would be able to look at. Okay? And they might not find as many errors as you would with a cognitive walkthrough, but you can do it with lower level of expertise, so it's a less expensive way of doing things. Then we have Schneiderman, is another person who looked at heuristics, and he's got 8 rules. So consistency, cater to universal usability, offer informative feedback, design dialogues to yield closure. So you want to get to the end of a story, instruction set, something like that. Prevent errors, permit easy reversal of actions, support internal locus of control, and reduce short-term memory load. So these are all very similar to the 10 on the previous slide. You see a lot of overlap between them. Okay, and so this is the idea with heuristic evaluation. We don't, we're got this list of things that we're going to go through, and you can choose this list or you can choose the previous list, and you should find about 75% of the usability issues if you go through carefully. Okay, so when you're looking at these heuristics, you probably usually rate them on a scale of 0 to 4, 0 being no problem at all, 4 being a catastrophic problem. Right. Here's an example of a number 4. How many people would automatically click on the link? Okay, and review-based evaluation. So results from the literature are used to support or refute parts of a design. It's cheaper than running experiments. You need to be careful to ensure that the results from a previous experiment are actually transferable to the current design. And you need to make sure that there's a match between the experimental designs chosen, the populations used, the analyses performed, and the assumptions made. So the idea is you're looking at an evaluation that's been made of a similar interface and taking all the flaws that were in that interface and checking them against the one that you're looking at now and saying, yeah, we've managed to avoid that, or we've improved that by that sort of thing. But in order to do that, you need to be confident that it's valid to compare the 2 interfaces. It's valid to compare the 2 user groups. They're the same types of tasks being performed on the 2 interfaces, that sort of thing. But it's cheap, right? Because you don't have to have users involved. Anything that doesn't require you getting users into a lab or going into the user's natural environment is a lot cheaper. And finally, model-based evaluation. So, Fitts law is an example of model-based evaluation. Fitts law is the thing that controls basically hand movement, right? If you're told to, if your hand is here and you're told to touch the entry rate thing, typically what you'll do is you'll zoom up here and then you'll do minor corrections as you get close. Okay? And there is actually a formula that you can use that tests, very carefully captures that model of movement, right? Known as Fitts law, right? And basically, the time it takes to move to a position is proportional to the distance to the thing, and you can get very accurate models of it. And so what this has done is it's looked at different types of input and how quick it gets to get the rate for the entry rate in terms of word per minute and the throughput in terms of correct words per minute. Okay, so typing, very fast entry rate, throughput, pretty good as well, right? It's actually pretty poor typist, where it looks like they're only getting about half correct. But you can see, so I don't even know what these different interfaces are. Handwriting's an obvious one. It's the slowest, right? They're making even more mistakes with the handwriting. But anyway, that's the idea. But they're different, like stylus type interfaces and that type of thing is what they're looking at. So, in terms of choosing an evaluation method, well, what stage is it in the life cycle is part of it. Remember, users are more happy to give critical feedback early in the life cycle. No? What style of evaluation? How objective is it going to be? So when we're talking about satisfaction, it isn't objective at all. What types of measure are we going to look at? What level of information? What level of interference? Okay, are we just going to watch people doing the thing? Or are we going to get them to do a speak aloud protocol? If we get them to do a speak aloud protocol, it does actually can change the way they think about the problem. Okay, so that's a downside of it. If they're actually forced to explain their actions, they will think more carefully about their actions and they will change their actions because they're thinking about them more carefully. Okay, so it's all a bit complicated. What sort of resources are available in terms of time, subjects, equipment and expertise? And these are all things that are going to impact upon how you're going to evaluate your usability. But you need to involve your users, okay? It's not, you can't just rely upon the expert methods to do. You can do them as a first pass if you like. You know, that they, as it says, they can eliminate up to 75% of the usability problems. So you could do that as a first pass, and then produce something that your users look at that's got those final 25% that need ironing out. So good design is about usability, ensuring that the systems are accessible for all, and ensuring that the designs are acceptable for the people in the contexts in which they will use them. The designers need to evaluate their designs with people and involve people in the design process. Okay? We're talking about user-centered design here. And you know, that's not every type of software system where you're really going to be so focused on users, but anything where there is a lot of user input to a user interface or something like that, you probably do want to take a user-centered design perspective. If you're talking about a system which is doing automated processing of data, on the other hand, maybe your focus isn't so strongly on the users. Okay, you're still going to have some users, because if you're processing data, presumably you're processing data for consumption at some point by users, and it's going to have to be presented to them in some way, that sort of thing. But it just depends upon what your system is. However, because you lot, we're focusing on web technology particularly, we are thinking about users, because web-based designs always have users. Yeah. And we want to have designs appropriate to the context of use as well, right? So it's all very well to test in a constrained laboratory experiment, but usually most systems are not used in isolation. They're used in a broader context, and you need to understand what that broader context is and how it's going to impact on them. Okay, so basically human-computer interaction is inherently multidisciplinary. Okay, so we're coming at it from a computer science perspective, but there are aspects of art and design involved, there are aspects of psychology involved, and engineering. You haven't had a contest. This was 15 minutes ago. Okay, discussion questions. So we've developed a prototype for a theatre booking system aimed at reducing queues at the box office. Choose an appropriate evaluation method and identify the participants, the techniques used, the representative tasks to be examined, the measurements of what would be appropriate, and an outline plan for carrying out the evaluation. Alright? So first thing you need to think about is, so what is this theatre booking system going to look like? Well, it's replacing the queues at the box office. Right, so when people go to the theatre and they're queuing at the box office, what are they doing? What tasks do you do when you're queuing at the box office?
They are waiting.
They're waiting for
In the queue to buy a ticket.
To buy a ticket? Yeah. Okay, what else do they do apart from buy a ticket?
Selecting movies or selecting anything that they want to watch.
Thinking about which ones they want, which sessions they want to go to, or something like that. Yeah.
And choose the type of the seat, front or back.
Yeah. So in some cases they'll choose where they're going to sit. Yeah.
If they are family.
Yeah. So could be families, yes, or individuals, or groups, or
The payment method.
Yeah, so I'm not worried about what they do when they get to the front of the queue. I'm saying, okay, so they're standing in the queue. Why might they be standing in the queue? They might be standing in the queue to buy tickets. They might be standing in the queue to, because it's easier to make their choice while they're standing in the queue, because they know they have to stand in the queue for a long time. And they can see the boards with all the sessions up there and that sort of thing. They, what was the other one we had?
Choose a movie.
Choosing the movie, yeah. Choosing a session, choosing the seats where they're going to sit in the thing. So they might be thinking about that while they're in the queue. Anything else? They might be just collecting pre-booked tickets. So they might have ordered online and just wanting to collect tickets. Yeah. They might be wanting to make inquiries about a group booking. Okay, so they might, be saying they want to take a school group to a Christmas pantomime, and they might just be making inquiries. So all of these things are the things that people who are standing at the theatre in the box office queue might be waiting to do. So if we're creating a prototype of a theatre booking system, these are the things that the theatre booking system might want to provide, right? So assuming that we have managed to put them into our prototype for the theatre booking system, how are we going to identify participants? What sort of participants are we going to have for evaluating? Or first of all, what evaluation method are we going to use?
I realize environment. So we just as a prototype of the real system.
Okay, if it's a prototype and we want to put it into a real life situation, you need to be very careful to explain to people, particularly with this type of thing, that it is a prototype and that they're not actually going to get their tickets when they do it. Okay, because you're asking them to waste time effectively, because they're still going to have to queue at the box office if it's only a prototype. If it was a Wizard of Oz, though, we could use it, because what we would be doing is having a person behind the machine act as the machine, and they would actually be able to get their tickets at the end of the information that they want, whatever information, whether it was their tickets or information about what screenings were available or whatever. So a prototype might not be the most appropriate thing if you're going to do it in a real world situation. But a Wizard of Oz experiment in this case, where we get the functionality of the system without the full implementation, that is, I'm 15 minutes late, where we get the functionality of the system without doing the full implementation of the system, that would be appropriate to put into a real world situation. You see why? Because you don't want to ask the random people coming to the theatre to try something out without getting anything from it, okay? But if they can try it out and get the same service that they should at the box office, then it might be appropriate to do, okay? So, let's say we'll go for Wizard of Oz. How do we select our participants?
Age group. Age group.
Age group. Okay, so I think actually if you're going to do a Wizard of Oz type experiment, you would just do it randomly and say, here's the box office and here's an alternative, and just split it. Okay? Because if we're doing that sort of thing, presumably we're going to get more than the 5 or 10 participants that you would normally get for a lot of usability type testing. You're basically going to split the people coming into the theatre, okay? And they're going to choose probably the shortest queue, right? But you'll get a decent sample of people and probably a fairly random sample of people as well, right? So if you were doing a laboratory experiment for this type of thing though, selecting your participants would be a lot more difficult. Because how would you do your laboratory experiment? You know, typically when you go to the box office, you have one task in mind. Are you going to get people to come into the laboratory just to do one task? Right? That's a big ask of people. Are you going to get people to give them a whole list of tasks that they should do at the box office? Well, it's not very natural anymore then, is it? Right? So, you know, it's very much about what your system is about, what's the most appropriate way of testing it, and that sort of thing. A prototype, I find it hard to see how a prototype would work in this situation, really. Okay, where you're talking about members of the general public who want to come and use the thing. You'd want some sort of functionality to it, I think. Right? Okay, the techniques used. Well, you're probably going to be recording, right? You're going to need some sort of informed consent. In this situation, when we're talking about Wizard of Oz in a natural environment, you would have to have very clear signposting saying, video recording, this is a new experimental design, we're capturing these things. If you join this queue, you probably would even have a person at the thing to make sure that people understood that they knew that they were consenting to participate in an experiment. Okay, because it's about informed consent. And you know, you have a sign up there in English. How many people are going to read the sign? Even if they can speak English. How many people might have difficulty reading the sign? How many people are coming where English is not their first language? You know, that sort of thing that you need to pay attention to. Do you need to get signed consent from the participants? Maybe, maybe not. Okay. In a situation like this, it's a little bit of a grey area. If you can say that they knew that they had informed consent when they joined this queue, and that by joining the queue they gave informed consent, then maybe you don't need to have signed consent. Okay. But you certainly would want to have a video recording so that you can see how people are using the system. Representative tasks to be examined. Well, they're going to be those things that we talked about. It's meant to be replacing the box office, so you look at what the representative tasks at the box office are. And you're going to try and get examples of all of them. But you're not going to, if you're doing a Wizard of Oz type experiment in this situation, you're not going to tell people what tasks they should be doing. You're just going to hope that you get people who are performing those tasks come up to your thing. So this probably is one of those situations where you keep doing your usability testing until you find all your problems. Okay, and you don't have any, you know, you keep running it for as long as you can to make sure that you cover all your cases. Right? If you've got a more controlled experiment, you can get people to say, I'd like you to perform this set of tasks or that set of tasks, or you know, and cover all your different task sets that way. What sort of measurements would be appropriate?
Surveys, maybe? We ask them after the experiment.
Yeah, so use satisfaction surveys, certainly. What about some quantitative ones? Things that you can measure.
How fast they bought the ticket, or
Yeah,
how fast?
how quickly, once they get to the machine, how quickly can they get a ticket or get the information that they want? How many mistakes do they make when they're trying to find the information that they want? Did they get the seat? If they're looking to book a particular seat in a particular place, could they get what they wanted? That type of thing. You know, did they get what they wanted? Did they get a ticket for the session of the movie that they wanted? You know, that type of thing. And an outline plan for carrying out the evaluation. I think we've talked about this because we've been talking about what the Wizard of Oz experiment would look like. We've talked about this along the way. So this idea of having splitting the people coming in, getting informed consent as they arrive, and then just recording things as they use the system. Okay, so two more questions. First of all, in a usability test, list 3 reasons why the user's personal data might be challenging and propose solutions to minimise the associated risks.
Because it's something related to the ethics, so we need to be careful about the personal data.
Yeah, so personal data is tricky, and it's become more tricky since May this year with the European GDPR laws. So you're only allowed to collect personal data for specific purposes, and you're only allowed to store it for a specific length of time, and you know, it's very, very restrictive about what personal data you can store and how long you can store it for and how you have to protect it, and you know, basically, it's initially looked quite challenging, and it has been quite challenging. So the university had to adapt practices. For example, student numbers are personal data. We used to list exam results in lists on the wall with student numbers and exam results. Can't do that anymore. Okay, because you can't put the student number next to the personal name. Email addresses are personal data. Right? So you can't just send out, yes?
I think it's very important to explain to the user which kind of information
Yes.
they need and how can they use it.
Exactly.
And also they can collect signature on this or make a contract or something.
Yeah, exactly. So it is very important for the people collecting the data to say exactly what personal data will be stored and how it's going to be stored, how it's going to be safeguarded. And it doesn't have to be a signature, it can be on an electronic form, it can be a box that they tick. But yes, there needs to be consent given for that data, right? So in terms of using the personal data, if you've got if you've collected this data and you've got this really rich data set and it contains all this personal data in it, and then we want to do something with the results of this, and we might want to publish some studies or something like that. It can be difficult to use any individual bit of data. So for example, if you've done a recording and there's a bunch of recordings, and one particular recording shows a really good example of the way that the system wasn't used in exactly the way that was planned, for example, and you wanted to use that as an exemplar. But that particular exemplar had something on the screen that personally identified the user, right? So you would have to have some way of redacting that personal information from the user if you were going to publish it, right? There are situations where you can get the users to give informed consent to allow their names to be published or something like that, but it would be very unusual to have more than just a personal identifier like a name attached to them. Okay, you wouldn't want to include their home phone number or their mobile phone number, for example. You know, how would you feel if you entered your mobile phone into a form when you were doing a web form or something like that, and then 5 months later you saw it published in an article, a picture of the screenshot that had your mobile phone number on you wouldn't be happy, right? So that's the sort of thing that you need to be thinking about all the time, is how do we, if we're going to be collecting personal data, how much of it is essential in terms of the evaluation of our system, or could we just replace it with dummy data and it would be perfectly acceptable, right? Dummy data, so just, you know, wherever they put something personal in, just replace it by random thing, okay?
Random name.
Random name, random phone number, random.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
but the results are the previous one from the. I mean, is the original one, but we have to replace the name.
Yeah, so well, that's the question: is how much of it can you replace? Is there certain information in the system where it's going to be necessary in your evaluation later to know that it didn't work because of the particular nature of their personal data? Or is the personal data actually irrelevant to the evaluation of the system? But there might be situations where, you know, it didn't work because they had a phone number with an unusual format, for example. So they tried to put an international phone number in which case that is important information. And, you know, so you need to do a very fine balance between what is the critical information that we need to store and how much can we anonymize any personal data that we store. And generally, you want to get rid of as much personal data as you can, because you don't want to be tasked with maintaining anything about personal data, but you don't want to throw away something that is important. So, for example, a person's name might have caused the system to break because they have an unusual character in their name. You know, a C with a cedilla or something like that, and the system just doesn't cope with that type of thing. That's important information. So you need their name in that situation. You know, it's a balancing act. But you want to minimize the risks as much as possible by anonymizing things. Okay, Amazon Dot. Who's seen an Amazon Dot? That's an Amazon Dot. It's a little thing about this big. The Amazon Echo is the big tower thing. It's a speaker, basically, with microphones, and you can ask it questions, and it can play music. Yeah. So what sort of things would you evaluate with that for usability testing?
The efficiency of the interaction of the system.
Okay. What sort of measures of efficiency would you use?
How long it takes to respond to me.
Yep. So how quickly do you get a response from it? What else?
How many times he doesn't understand you? What you say?
Exactly. So I love these because it makes my kids speak clearly. So my kids tend to mutter and not talk very clearly and that sort of thing. But if they're talking to Amazon, they all of a sudden talk very properly. Right? You do, yeah. And I think that people who have accented voices, which is the vast majority of people in this room, probably find it even more challenging. I know even with my Australian accent, sometimes it doesn't understand me. Right? So how quickly it responds to you, how accurate is it in understanding you. What else? We've got two things that we can evaluate. Third one?
How attractive it looks.
Yeah, that's valid. So you could. It's not really usability; it's acceptability, that criteria. So, but you know how comfortable the person feels with it in their personal space. You know how likely they are to have it as a feature in their space. But given that's an acceptability feature rather than a usability one, can we have another usability one?
Maybe the time of battery.
The time of
battery.
The battery, it's mains charge. It's got a mains cable, even though it's not shown in this picture. I don't think anything ran off battery. But yeah, that was good. If it ran off battery, that would be certainly one. So I would say, to what extent can it answer the questions that the user wants, right? Because you're meant to be able to ask it anything. And it's very good if you say, what's the weather going to be like? Right? But sometimes if you ask it, what time does the next bus leave? Sometimes they're very good, and sometimes they're dreadful. Okay, and it depends. They are quite location specific, so you register it to be at a certain address, and it will know where the nearest bus stop and everything is. But it depends on the quality of information that it can access, of course. Right? So if your bus company gives up-to-date data about when the buses are running and when they're running late and that sort of thing, it will give it accurate information, but not otherwise. Okay, so there's three, and you could probably think of other, you know, if you went away and think about it, you could think of other usability ones, but that's three. If you want to learn more about user-centered design, there's a whole bunch of books, a couple of videos available on YouTube, and they're just the tip of the iceberg. There's many, many more, right? There are whole courses on human-computer interaction, right? So, you know, it is a wide area of research, and there is possibilities for doing a lot more than what we've done today. But we don't have space to do a lot more, unfortunately. Keep these things in mind, though, when you're doing design for web-based design particularly, as you will have to do next semester.